to feel comfortable coming in here, but I also want those very same people when they come here, and also the people who work here, the thousands of people who work here every day, to be safe. It's 2017, and there are things happening around the world that none of us like. We deeply regret them, and they have to cause you, though, to think about these things, and in the possession of these kinds of reports, to decide on whether doing nothing is an acceptable option. And so I guess now what we want to hear from is from the public. Because I want to hear from the employees who work in here, our staff, our city staff, and I want to hear from the public. What the politicians think, will be fine. But I want to hear from the public about that balancing act and where you kind of draw that line. And so I won't be telling you that I'm in favor or opposed to any particular proposal, nor is that matter necessarily, right in front of us at this moment, until I've heard from people as to where they think that balance can be achieved. I will say this. The public go to rock concerts, they go to hockey games, they go in many, many other buildings in the city, including Queen's Park, courthouses, even sometimes private sector office buildings, where they face a lot more security than they face here. And I'm not sure which one is right, but I'm just saying there's a clear discrepancy between the two, and I guess part of what we'd want to have a discussion about with the public and with our employees, how do we keep people safe, and what's the right, series of changes that you'd want to make from a situation where we have almost no security.
What are the experts telling you in terms of the urgency around protecting City Hall?
Well, nobody is sort of pushing any panic buttons in these reports, again, without violating confidences, but I think they say the obvious, which is that when you have the iconic City Hall, where the seat of government exists for the city of Toronto, the biggest city in the country, the most prominent city in the country around the world, and you have all the thousands of people who visit here and who work here every day, that it is one building that you can't afford to just say, well, everything will be fine. Because I don't think any place can afford to take that position anymore. And so my job becomes, with my colleagues, to decide on a responsible, balanced approach to these kinds of things. There are recommendations made in this report which have been discussed in the media today in part, and we'll have to consider those and other options that do more or less, and try to do the right thing to do what's the most important thing: keep people safe in 2017.
This glass wall inside chamber, does that seem like a bit much?
I guess a concern has been expressed, and I have my seat is in the front row of the council, and so I sit there, and nobody would be likely to be able to sort of physically, come at me as just one member of council. But there are others who sit in the back row, and they're literally 4 or 5 feet away from meetings that you've seen yourselves have turned angry before. And it's sometimes a thin line between people being angry and deciding they're going to do something that we would all describe as irrational. But I just think that to consider these things is the main thing. But make no mistake, the main concern of this report is not politicians and what goes on with politicians. It is the thousands of people from the public and from our staff that come here every day, thousands of people every day, and we have to keep them safe first and foremost. So to me, if we never considered the glass and all those things that have to do with politicians, that would be fine. We do have to consider the matter of public safety in here, the visitors and the people who work here every day.
Mayor Tory, when you ask the Toronto Police Service and Public Safety Canada for an assessment of threat, aren't you necessarily going to get like a fairly extreme reaction? I think if I ask these people about my home security, they'd start talking about shootings in the neighborhood, and maybe I should put up a glass wall around my house. Like, isn't that?
I think, from the public safety officials and the national security people, you're going to get a more sort of conservative, if I can call it, a sort of report, yes. However, this is the sort of conundrum you face when you're in a job like mine or Councillor Robinson's, which is if you didn't ask them at all for their views, then you'd be criticized for that. If you ask them and then you have their advice and you sort of completely ignore it, then you'd be criticized for that. And so, the job here is to try and find that balance. And so that's why I'm standing here deliberately and not saying, well, everything they recommend to me is automatically what should be done because they said so, but nor am I saying that the proper answer is to do nothing. In 2017, when we've seen events around the world, including at buildings like this, where terrible things have happened, and the terrible things have most often happened to innocent members of the public or people who happen to be doing their jobs at work. And I think we have some obligation to look at what we can do to make sure those people are kept safe first and foremost. We also work in this building, but I think the focus should be on those thousands of people who work here and who visit here.
Is there some space, though, between securing the entire building with airport-style security, meaning that brides and grooms headed to the chapel will have to be searched and go through a metal detector, and you get a building permit to return a library book, and maybe securing just the inner part of the building where people might have access to public figures?
Well, you're articulating very well what I'm talking about by looking at a range of options. And so we have the reports we have that David referred to, and they make one set of recommendations. And then there are clearly other options that range all the way from doing nothing to doing even more than they say. And so that's why I really do want to hear from the public about this. And I really want to hear from the people who work in this building. And in here, you work in this building too. I'd be delighted to hear from you as individuals as to your own feeling of safety. But I think in the end that, you have to consider all of that. I mean, do you want brides and grooms, for example? I mean, what about just us coming in and out of this building? I mean, we would all face different changes that have to be made. But I think the one thing that's certain is this: the world is not standing still. Regrettably, deeply regrettably, there are things happening around the world that we cannot ignore. And if we did ignore them, you'd be the first people quite properly asking me the morning after something that had ever happened, and God forbid it should, why didn't we do more, especially if we have a report suggesting we should look at these things. And so that's what we're doing. We're going to do it carefully and in a considerate way, but also not, sort of taking an undue period of time, only because we know that it's a very complicated time, and so we have to address that.